Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about ADHD in women and the gender data gap. And we are watching a video that was suggested in our educational videos channel in our Discord. And this is actually exactly what that educational videos channel is for. Is y'all sort of like give ideas of things that that you learn about, that you see on like YouTube or wherever, that you think would be cool for the community to learn about, and then we sort of watch them together and we learn about them together. So like this is not, ADHD is not like an area that I am necessarily an expert in. I actually know a fair bit about it because of Healthy Gamer, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's something that I'm an expert in. And so like we're going to sort of learn about it together, and then there are some sort of themes in this video that I'm sort of excited to talk about. So we're going to be talking about that as well. So let's get into it. Here we go.
Hello brains! In case you haven't noticed, I am a woman with ADHD, which means I have the same mental health condition as a man with ADHD, but it does affect me differently. Before I jump into this, I want to point out that in my episode on ADHD in girls, I had a lot of guys in the comments going, wait, I have the girl presentation? There is no girl presentation of ADHD. It's just that we know from research that women, at least cisgendered women, we don't have enough research yet on those who are both neurodiverse and gender diverse, tend to present differently than cis men due to a combination of biological and social factors, and that difference can mean our ADHD doesn't get recognized or treated effectively. Also, some of this may apply regardless of gender because everyone is different. Anyone can have the more internalized presentation of neurodiversity that sometimes gets missed. So if any of this sounds familiar, the conclusion is the same. Go get checked out, get the support you need. Okay, so let's jump into the research. ADHD is the same disorder no matter what gender you are. The same brain regions and neurotransmitter systems are affected, and the same core deficits are present. But the resulting symptoms, what people actually see, can show up differently due to the biological difference between males and females, as well as the social differences in the experiences of men and women. As a result of gender and sex differences, ADHD leads to different presentations and outcomes. For example, women are often expected to be good at organizing, planning, and other executive functions, and society is generally less forgiving to women when they mess up. We tend to work harder to fit in and be good due to social pressures. Females with ADHD tend to show more inattentiveness than hyperactivity or impulsiveness, and are more likely than males to develop anxiety, self-esteem issues, and other internalizing problems, while
Okay, so I want to stop real quick because she moves fast. So I want to talk real quick about like this sort of like first concept that I think is really, really important, is like one of the big things that she's talking about is that because the sort of like gender roles of men and women are different, how ADHD is going to manifest in each individual person is going to manifest differently. Because obviously, like, if you have different sort of like expectations and different ways that you are sort of expected to behave in the world, like the like disease or the way that your mind works is going to show up differently for different people. The best way that I can sort of describe this, because I'm a nerd, is this idea of like genotypes and phenotypes. So, oh God, I'm gonna get it backwards. Oh God, which one is it? Oh God. Anyway, so the basic idea is that in our genes we have certain like combinations of DNA, and that combination of DNA results in in like the infinite variety that is humans, and then depending on how that DNA is arranged, it creates sort of like external things that we can see, which I believe are called phenotypes. I hope I'm not getting that backwards. The genotype is the like actual combination. The phenotype is how it shows up in the real world. Thank you. Okay, I was right. So that being said, like this is a very similar idea, and this is something that I think that Western medicine really fails a lot at. Because in Western medicine, the way that we sort of think about medicine is that we don't treat people, we treat diseases. So like when you really think about it, like we give medicine for depression, we give medicine for anxiety, we give medicine for ADHD. We don't give medicine to people. And so the really important thing that I think that this video is talking about right now is this idea that depending on what what vessel the disease or the like different way of thinking or whatever is in, it's going to manifest differently. You cannot separate the disease from the person, because as soon as you do that, you're missing huge chunks of like important stuff that is informing it. Now, like that being said, it makes sense that like we can't create medicines to treat every single individual person. It just wouldn't be practical. And so like in the interest of being able to like give medicine, we do these huge like trials where we test a whole bunch of people and we see sort of like what affects the majority in a positive way. And by doing that, we are able to affect sort of a majority of the population. But unfortunately, what happens is that there are these huge gaps of like people that just like the medicine doesn't work for and that sort of get left out. And we'll get more into that in a second. But I just wanted to sort of talk about that idea and that concept.
Males with ADHD tend to develop more externalizing problems, like rule breaking or aggression, than females do. That's not to say that girls and women with ADHD don't also experience hyperactivity and impulsivity symptoms. We do. Those symptoms are just a little less obvious. They might take the form of racing thoughts, speaking before thinking, talking really quickly.
Welcome to Raid Shadow Legends.
And not sponsored. I'm not even sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. How dare you? How dare you play a Raid? I'm not even sponsored.
And relationship problems. Also, for those of us who menstruate, our ADHD symptoms may change or worsen during certain parts of our menstrual cycle. And
okay, so this isn't even fair. This isn't even fair. Like, okay, so sure, like, you know, like moon cycles are not even fair in the first place. The fact that like women have to deal with this, like, I mean, people who have moon cycles have to deal with this like super intense thing every month that like men don't have to deal with. But then on top of that, now if you have ADHD and you have to deal with moon cycles, it also like exacerbates your ADHD. Oh, it's not even fair. Okay, continuing on.
During certain stages of life, like puberty, pregnancy, post-pregnancy, menopause, when we have these big hormonal changes. So our ADHD presentation and treatment needs may change as well. Cool, okay, but my doctor knows all that, right? Probably not. Most research on ADHD has been done in males, and the DSM criteria for ADHD doesn't fit the way females tend to present as well as it does for males.
And now we hit like it to me, like this is the most important concept of the entire video, which is this idea of the gender data gap. Okay, so first of all, I just want to sort of like plug a book that I learned about this from. Hold on. Okay, so this is the book. It's called Invisible Women: Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. So if anyone is interested in sort of like learning more about what I'm about to talk about, I would highly recommend checking out this book. It's a book that's written by like sort of like a feminist author, and she's fantastic. I really love this book. I listened to it on Audible, and it was a fantastic book. So I'd highly recommend if y'all are interested in what I'm about to talk about, be sure to check out this book. But what I was gonna say is that there are so many examples of this exact phenomenon where, because men sort of like run the world right now, we sort of treat women as like outliers. We sort of treat women as like the other. So like we do studies that are like basically for men. We sort of study men. And then like when like women sort of complicate the results, we're like, oh, like those are extraneous factors. And so we sort of just completely dismiss them. It's absolutely insane. Like I know it sounds like propaganda, but like I swear, like listen to this book, and like she gives example after example after example of how we do this in our society. It's terrifying, and it's all over the world. Like it's not just America that does this. All over the world, we do this. And it factors into just like so many insane parts of our lives. And so one of the things that's really important is that like we start, you know, actually studying women, because the truth is, I know that, you know, like people are trying to sort of like get rid of gender, and like I to a certain extent I can understand why. And at the same time, like in terms of sex, like biological sex, like there are significant differences between men, women, and then also sort of like other sexes as well, of like sort of like variants from that binary that aren't talked about as often. But it's so important that we start actually studying, that we start actually doing studies specifically for women, because the way that things function is different for them. And there's so much that we just don't know about that like women can't get help for because it's just not studied. So like, for instance, like there are fantastic alternatives to birth control out there that are just not implemented at all because people don't feel like putting in the research. There's just like, there's no funding for it, and like people don't do it. There's a great documentary series on Netflix called Explained. That's just like, it's a mini documentary series where they do like little tiny episodes, and they have one episode where they talk about birth control, and they talk about how many alternatives there are that we're just not using that would actually be way better for women, that wouldn't like fork up women's systems in this way. Like by like pumping hormones into their system, that we just don't use because there's no funding for it. Men just aren't interested in making this a reality. So anyway, let's continue.
As a result, a lot of women with ADHD get misdiagnosed with depression or bipolar disorder and end up getting the wrong medication or a less effective one. Those of us who internalize our symptoms are far less likely to be referred for diagnosis, less likely to receive a diagnosis if we are referred.
This is also really important. So ADHD is simultaneously one of the most overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed illnesses that's out there. And you may be asking, like, what the heck? Like, how could it simultaneously be over and underdiagnosed? So the way that works is it is overdiagnosed for people that don't actually have it. It's like misdiagnosed, where like people don't actually have it, but we give it to them. And it's underdiagnosed in that we miss it. We completely miss it. And there's a really interesting correlation where the larger a classroom size is, the higher, like compared to like like one teacher to how many students, the larger chance of the larger percentage of kids are going to get diagnosed with ADHD in that classroom. Whereas like the smaller the classroom size, the less kids are going to have ADHD. Obviously, that's not actually true, but the way that we diagnose ADHD right now causes this discrepancy. Because really what we're diagnosing is like, oh, like you're not fitting into society in the way that we want you to. So we're going to put drugs inside of you to make sure that you behave.
And less likely to be treated with stimulant medication even if we do get a correct diagnosis. Despite the fact that stimulant medication is the first-line medication used to treat ADHD, and it works just as well for females as it does for males. Even if we are diagnosed and treated with stimulant medication, it's really unlikely that our hormones will be taken into consideration. Personally, no one suspected I had ADHD as a kid because I was a good kid and because I was smart. But the truth is, I went to some pretty extreme lengths to hide the fact that I was struggling, and I hated myself every time I couldn't.
This is a huge, huge deal. This is something that people do not account for. It's such a mind-blowing concept to me that like there are so many people out there that are currently sort of like masking their symptoms to try to fit into society. Because the thing is that like this comes up with autism too. So like people who have autism or people who have ADHD oftentimes are incredibly intelligent. And so what they're able to do is they're able to sort of mask their symptoms. They're able to sort of like push through their symptoms and like appear normal. And so they just get missed. They just like they don't get the help that they need. And then like at a certain point they get to a point in their life where like they can no longer do that. And like things are like too severe, like things are too hard in order to do that anymore. And then all of a sudden they're like they could have been getting help all these years, and now they're like way behind and they're suffering a whole lot more. And it creates all sorts of like issues with self-confidence. It creates all sorts of issues with like struggling in like keeping up in life. It's not good. And a big part of the reason that this is because of all the shame and stigma around this sort of stuff in our society. The fact that we view, like when people don't fit in, we view it as sort of like a sickness that needs to be treated rather than like a diversity in our society. Because that's the thing, is that like things like autism and things like ADHD, it's really just sort of like a different way that the mind works, and it just doesn't happen to fit into our mold of society, and it causes a lot of problems.
I came home without my jacket, or lost the really pretty earrings someone bought me for my birthday, or didn't get invited to parties, or couldn't remember the question the teacher just asked. Despite my best efforts, I still picked up a lot of not fun labels. Spacey, messy, clumsy, weird, forgetful, flaky, lazy, irresponsible. But I didn't talk to anyone about it. I was ashamed of it. I tried my best to hide it. It wasn't until my symptoms became more obviously problematic to others, more externalized,
get it, girl,
when I was going through puberty, hormonal changes, and started rage-quitting conversations. When my coping mechanisms weren't working anymore because the demands on my executive function had changed and I started doing badly in school. That my family even noticed there was a problem. Even then, the first doctor my mom took me to told her I couldn't have ADHD because I had done well in elementary school. Thankfully, my mom told that doctor, "Thanks for your opinion. I'd like to see a specialist." And I was diagnosed with ADHD.
Good work, Mom.
She was willing to try stimulant medication to see if it helped, which it did, a lot. But even after that, it felt like no one really took my ADHD seriously, so I didn't take it seriously. I didn't ask for accommodations. I didn't get coaching or therapy for it. I even went off my meds completely for a while because someone I trusted told me I didn't need them. Even after I dropped out of community college, got in a bunch of car accidents, went through a divorce, got fired from several jobs, ruined my credit, developed generalized anxiety disorder, and had my first panic attack. I was actually embarrassed to start this channel because I was so sure that my struggles weren't all that bad, because I was comparing them to what I saw in my brother and my cousin, the symptoms that were more obvious to others.
So this is another really important concept that I've talked about here before, but I always want to take the chance to reiterate it because I think that it is so widespread in our society and something that's not talked about very often. One of the things that the Buddha said is that we are all entitled to two things, death and suffering. And that sounds really sort of bleak and dark when you hear it just plain out. But I think that like one of the I don't know, like interpretations of that sort of phrase is that a lot of the time what we do in our societies, we sort of gatekeep suffering. We say like, oh, because other people have it worse, I don't have the right to suffer. Or, like because I have a lot of privilege, I don't have a right to suffer. And the truth is, everyone has a right to suffer. Everyone is going to suffer, whether you admit it to yourself or not, or whether you, sort of allow yourself to see it in others or not. Like, people suffer across the board. And so the more that we can sort of be accepting of everyone's suffering and, be compassionate to everyone's suffering, I think the farther along we're going to get in our society. And this is something that's really important just from sort of like, as you're sort of like working with yourself, I think that it's really important to acknowledge that just because somebody else has it worse doesn't mean that your struggle isn't valid. And that can be really hard to emotionally accept. You can sort of know that logically, but emotionally it still feels like, no, like, I still don't deserve like, compassion or pity or whatever because other people have it worse. And sort of like working through that with like a therapist or, like if you feel like that's something that you can work through by yourself is something that's really important and it will make a big difference in, progressing through life.
Even once I was diagnosed, I didn't get adequate treatment for my ADHD. I didn't feel like it was even okay to need extra support for my ADHD until my frustration with my struggles got so bad, I literally started a YouTube channel about them. And I hear from a lot of women that say their struggles were either missed completely, misdiagnosed, or that they were treated for other mental health conditions for years or even decades before anyone recognized the underlying ADHD. So
this is another really important concept. This one I learned directly from Dr. K. Dr. K talked about how one of his mentors told him, if somebody walks into your office with like 3 or more mental health diagnoses, they're all wrong. Because the thing is that when you go to get diagnosed for some sort of mental health condition, what's going to happen is like sort of depending on the how to phrase this, depending on the context in which you put it, it can look like many different things. So like, for instance, if you go in and you're talking about like feeling anxious while talking with someone, you might get diagnosed with social anxiety. And then like, if you are talking about how like sometimes you have trouble getting out of bed in the morning, you might get diagnosed with depression. Or if you talk about how you're having a hard time like focusing at school, you might get diagnosed with ADHD. And so there are all of these different sort of like branches that like can lead to the same root, but that get diagnosed just like sort of by the branches themselves. And so it's really important to sort of find somebody that like actually takes the full picture into account. Because a lot of times doctors nowadays will just sort of like throw out a diagnosis and send you on your way without actually sort of taking the full picture into account. So I just highly encourage y'all to like, if you are getting diagnosed and like you feel like something isn't quite right, you don't sort of like synergize with something, like just because they're a doctor doesn't mean that they're always going to be right. And like getting a second opinion is always a good idea. And like making sure that like you actually vibe with the person, like, you know, in any kind of relationship, it's important to sort of like date around. And so I do think that it's important to do that with like your mental health professionals and all that jazz.
So what can we do? Educate ourselves and others on how ADHD affects women differently and make sure we're getting the support we need. Here's what we know. ADHD in women is typically more severe than it looks. Symptoms are external manifestations of internal struggles. So if we have a primarily inattentive presentation and we're taught to mask our struggles, we're not going to look as ADHD as we actually are. And this isn't just true for women. Anyone who's faced strong social and cultural pressures to be good is likely to mask and internalize their ADHD symptoms. And this is true for autism as well. We may minimize how much we're struggling. According to research, women tend to underreport their symptoms, while men tend to overreport. And if we've developed comorbid anxiety or depression,
that part just like, I don't know that I really have anything sort of educational to say about that part, but that part just like hits me. Like the fact that it's so weird because on the one hand, like women, you know, men get sort of put into the men box where they're like not allowed to express their emotions. Like really in our society, the only emotion that men are really sort of like encouraged and allowed to express is anger. And so like a lot of men have a really, really hard time sort of recognizing and understanding their emotions because all they've ever learned how to express is anger. Whereas women like are typically much more sort of emotionally adept and are able to sort of talk about their emotions and feelings a lot easier. But it's so interesting to me, this idea that like women sort of have to like swallow their emotion. I don't know how to put it. They have to sort of swallow their suffering a lot more than men do. And you see this like in workplace, like at least I do. I feel like just sort of anecdotally, I see that men, like if they get a little bit sick, they're like, oh, I'm hopeless. I can't do anything. I need somebody to take care of me. And then women will they will have like a high grade fever and be like, no, like I got to go to work. I got to get shirt done. You know what I mean? And like, that is just such a fascinating sort of dichotomy in our society to me, of that like women express their emotions more, but have to sort of like swallow their suffering more. It's really weird. I don't know what it is. If y'all have thoughts on it, I would love to hear it.
depression or other mental health conditions, those are likely to be more obvious than our ADHD. Because of this, we're more likely to self-diagnose, aka be the first to recognize that we might have ADHD, and we might be more afraid to go to the doctor to get checked out, especially if we've been dismissed or misdiagnosed before. This is why I recommend going.
A couple of women, I'm not sure if it's actually a couple of people in chat are talking about moon cycles and how like women are just sort of used to suffering from moon cycles because like moon cycle, like the pain that women go through every single month is so severe that like they're just like, yeah, like what's the big deal? Whereas men, like we don't have like scheduled pain. Like if we're in pain, something is wrong. Whereas like with women, like they have scheduled pain that's supposed to be there. They're like, yep, this is what's supposed to happen every month, which is just insane to me. It's just mind blowing that that's like built in. That's so stupid. And men just like don't have to deal with that. Men are just like, no, you know, if I'm in pain, something's wrong, because that's what actually happens. I recently learned, so there's a process that your body goes through called necrosis. Okay. And necrosis is like literally a part of your body dying off. Okay. So like when you get frostbite, okay, and like you like lose a finger or something, your body is going through necrosis. So your finger is literally dying. Okay. And that's like pretty much the only time that our bodies go through that process is like when a part of our body, and it's painful, like it's not a pleasant process, when a part of our body is literally dying. And that being said, you know the one other time that our body actually does go through necrosis? During moon cycles. Isn't that insane to you? Like one of the reasons that moon cycles are so painful is because parts of your body are literally dying every month. Not like your cells where they're like, you know, like regenerating and like old cells get sort of like cycled out and new cells come. No. Parts of your body are literally dying every month. And like, that's just how it works. Isn't that crazy? Oh my God, it's crazy. Okay, let's keep going.
Going to doctors who specialize in ADHD or who are really familiar with it. And remember that whether it's ADHD or it does turn out to be something else, if you're struggling, there's a reason you're struggling. Our struggles being invisible to others doesn't mean they're imaginary. Also, it's just as important to get the support we need. While our struggles might not be.
Somebody in chat is sort of talking about how women are taught that, you know, like when they're on their moon cycle, like, oh, like you're just on your period. This is one of the reasons that I draw a lot of attention to moon cycles in my community, like why we have like the moon cycle fund and stuff, is because I really, really strongly believe that we sort of need to like shift that narrative. And I mean, that sounds obvious. Like obviously, like we should stop like undermining women for, you know, like being on their moon cycle. But like what I think is really important is like, I too think that moon cycles are actually not a good time to like work through stuff. So like if you get in an argument with your partner while they're on their moon cycle, or like while you're on your moon cycle, depending on, you know, which side you are, I actually don't think that it's a good time to like work through that argument. I think it may be something good to come back to. What I think that moon cycles are really, really useful for is that like during your moon cycles, everything is magnified. Okay, like everything is I think that's the best word. Everything is magnified. And so I think that moon cycles are a really great time for reflection. And you can see that like there are some societies, in my opinion, societies that sort of like had stuff like figured out in a really amazing way, like Native American societies, where they would like, women would separate during their moon cycles and like spend time with each other and like, you know, do things like meditation and reflection and things like that to sort of like get a better understanding of themselves, because it's so much easier to sort of like see the stuff that's going on internally for you when your hormones are sort of like magnifying all of this stuff. And so like, I think that it's one of the reasons that I wish like women would be able to like, women in our, I wish that our society gave women time to like sort of like be, like take that time for themselves during their moon cycles, because I think it'd be amazing for women to be able to sort of like meditate and reflect on like what's going on for them during their moon cycles. I think that they would get so much insight, and that I don't know, that's just something that I really want to sort of like encourage people to do. Like when you're feeling sort of like really, really super emotional on your moon cycle, sort of like sitting in that and like, you know, being compassionate with that side of yourself, I think is just super important.
As obviously problematic in the short term. Maybe we're doing well in school. Maybe we're not getting in trouble a lot. The long-term issues women with ADHD face are significant, like self-medicating, which can lead to addiction, or eating disorders, STIs or unplanned pregnancies. Chronic pain is common in women with ADHD. Self-harm, even attempts at suicide. The longer we go without getting the support we need, the longer we have to figure out how to cope on our own. And those coping mechanisms aren't always gonna be healthy. And the longer we go without understanding why we're struggling, the more dysfunctional beliefs we develop about ourselves and our abilities. Often, by the time our struggles are obviously problematic to others, our core beliefs about ourselves have already formed. This was true for me, and I am still undoing the damage. My terrible self-esteem set me up for abusive relationships. My difficulties fitting in created social anxiety. I'm still learning how to make friends. My symptoms might not have seemed like a big deal at the time, but the impact that they have had on my life long term absolutely was. And again, hormones impact our symptoms. Anyone who menstruates has regular hormone fluctuations that affect our ADHD. In addition to needing extra support during big transitions, it's good to be mindful of how our symptoms are affecting us at different points in our cycle and talk to our doctor about options. Some people might benefit from different doses of medication at different times of the month. We'll talk more about hormones in another episode because there's a lot to go into. And also, we need more research on that. Speaking of which, we need more research on all genders.
Gender
there's
data
not
gap.
as much research on ADHD in women, and there's barely any on those who are gender diverse. The research we do have suggests neurodiversity rates are a lot higher in the trans community. And since both biological factors and societal pressures impact ADHD, it's important we do that research so we can better recognize and support every brain, not just the ones we understand so far. Because honestly, no one should have to go through life blaming themselves for how their brain works, period. Thank you to my brain advocates and all my Patreon brains for supporting the work that we do. Because of you.
And I just want to say thank you to Rachel for recommending this video. I think it was a really great video. And I hope that y'all have enjoyed this education segment. I know that I really sort of enjoyed seeing this perspective of ADHD. And it sort of like naturally lended itself to like a lot of like ideas and concepts that I was excited to share. So I hope you all enjoyed it. And if you watch this over on YouTube, be sure to, like, comment, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. If you have questions, leave them in the comments. Thanks. Appreciate it.